On November 4th in Madrid, Spain, a very notable event will take place, a meeting of the leaders of the coalition of the willing. Let me remind you that this format currently unites 30 countries, but not all of them fully understand or have decided for themselves how and to what extent they should support Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russian aggression. The meeting, as reported by the publication El Mundo, will take place in a secret format. This does not mean at all that it will not be reported on. Of course, there are already leaks in the press. The meeting will take place and it is secret or confidential for a different reason. Everyone who will be present there, everyone who has confirmed their attendance, is obliged not to disclose the topics of this meeting in the public domain. Well, I don't recall a coalition meeting of willing leaders ever taking place under such conditions. This is the first time, and obviously the topics that will be raised there are quite serious and they prefer silence. Yes, this is exactly the stage of diplomacy right now that prefers silence. Another condition for attending this meeting, according to El Mundo, is that it is not allowed to be in the room with any communication devices turned on. This means tablets, phones. All of these will have to be left outside the negotiation room, and only then will the discussions take place. Why such extraordinary secrecy? Why such extraordinary measures? Obviously, the discussion will be about important matters that could be completely exploited either by Russian agents or by agents of influence of the Russian Federation in Europe. There is no announcement, unfortunately, about what exactly will be discussed, but there are certain signals about the main topics that might be raised there, and in fact, there are two of them, and they are extremely difficult. And now other publications are also writing about these topics. In particular, the first topic is quite interesting and rather dangerous in terms of the prospects for adopting anything positive for Ukraine at all. So, The Economist is publishing an article on this today. How much will it cost to stop Vladimir Putin? But let's read it this way. How much will the war in Ukraine cost in the coming years if it continues, right? So, we need to read this out because there are a lot of numbers. So, The Economist estimates that from 2026 to 2029, Ukraine will need about, and pay attention here, $389 billion in financial aid and weapons. In other words, friends, this figure is twice as much as what Ukraine has received from Europe since the start of the full-scale invasion. As you know, the United States is gradually stepping back from participating in the funding of Ukraine's defense industry. And in general, yes, they are shifting this entire burden onto European governments, purchasing weapons from the United States and then transferring them in the required or designated quantities to meet Ukraine's needs. And the signals we're getting from certain countries, these aren't the kinds of funds that actually match those figures with lots of zeros. It's mostly 10, 12, 20 million to support something. That's not it at all. According to analysts' estimates, Ukraine spends $65 billion a year on defense and another $73 billion on other state needs. At the same time, budget revenues amount to about $90 billion, so the annual deficit reaches 50. Well, these are actually very optimistic calculations by The Economist, because we know that even in the 2025 budget, there is already a huge gap of 300 billion hryvnias, and for the next year, it's completely unclear how much it will be or how all of this will play out. To cover these expenses and rebuild the country, Europe will need to increase funding to 0.4% of the GDP of NATO member countries, not including the United States of America. This means, well, in fact, that there is not enough money to continue the fighting or to maintain the momentum we had in the last, say, in 2025, 2024, 2023. Let's not count 2022, as it was quite unclear then. This prospect of continuing or maintaining this momentum, and this could become a key factor in forcing Ukraine to make certain concessions in order to finally wrap up this whole story together with Putin, together with Volodymyr Zelensky, and move it onto the negotiation track. No matter how much anyone resists today, this is the clear desire of European countries and even Ukraine's closest friends. Today, Tusk, just look at this as well. Poland is one of the participants in the coalition of the willing. Tusk comes out and says that starting from 2026, the possibility of duty-free import of Ukrainian goods into Poland and the European Union will be completely stopped. Poland is withdrawing from this agreement. But Tusk notes that when it comes to supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and fighting against the Russian Federation, no one can accuse me here. We remain supporters of Ukraine in this regard. This is quite a two-dimensional story. Why? Because the Ukrainian economy is inseparable from the military track. In order for the country to keep fighting, its economy needs to keep working. And this is exactly where the choice comes in, this Zugzwang. So what are we going to spend the money on if we get it? On the war or on the economy? Or is it possible to spend on both the war and the economy at the same time? Obviously not anymore. And that's exactly why everyone's mobile phones will be taken away, so that when everyone starts arguing with each other on the 4th, I remind you, in Madrid during the meeting of the coalition leaders, those who want to prevent this outburst so that it doesn't happen, so that there isn't the impression that now the whole coalition is quarreling among themselves and Ukraine is left alone. This is my explanation for this absolute A precaution. The second issue that will obviously be discussed during this meeting is yet another leak, which was reported by Radio Liberty, specifically by journalist Josvik 2 days ago. And what they wrote about, friends, is a peace plan that is currently being coordinated between Brussels and Kyiv regarding proposals on how to end the war. Well, now, in 2026 or whenever, it's not clear. But what's particularly interesting and noteworthy there is that it specifically states that if certain important agreements are reached between the involved parties, this ongoing war could actually, in theory, come to an end within just 24 hours. In this proposed plan, my friends, we actually have a total of 12 detailed points to consider. These 12 points are conditionally divided into two phases, 6 and 6. And what is being described there in this particular context is essentially an idealistic scenario that would obviously only suit Ukraine. There are certain leaks which journalists also write about, saying that officials close to Brussels were asked whether this plan could actually be implemented in any way, for example. And they say that, well, the chances are practically zero. Although there are points that would mean a titanic shift by Kyiv regarding concessions to the Russian Federation. So I'll just read them out schematically. Ceasefire and adoption of a peace plan within 24 hours. Monitoring of the ceasefire by the United States of America, Ukraine, and Russia agree on a non-aggression pact. The issue of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, transfer to a third party, lifting of symbolic sanctions after the ceasefire has lasted for an agreed number of days. And in fact, the last part of the first phase is the ceasefire itself. It is proposed to create a peace council chaired by President Trump. If all this happens, the second part of this plan is activated. So the first point, the line of contact remains in effect until the parties agree on permanent administration of the occupied territories. Next, the second point, security guarantees without details. Third, there must be a dialogue between Kyiv and Moscow to strengthen mutual understanding, respect, and diversity of languages, cultures, and religions. Here, there's a very interesting story regarding the diversity of languages, cultures, and religions. You know, yesterday, the Cabinet of Ministers withdrew from the Verkhovna Rada a rather interesting bill that would have excluded the Russian language from the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages and Cultures ratified by Ukraine. This means that the Russian language is protected under this charter, but not in Ukraine. Now, this bill has been withdrawn, and this is actually the second time it's happened. The first time was in 2024. Now it's happening again in 2025. There are several explanations for this. The first explanation is that an incorrect translation of this charter has led to us feeling European pressure regarding the implementation of the cluster for joining the European Union. And basically, we just have to do it and protect it, excuse my language. That's the opinion of Deputy Paturayev. And there is another explanation from European Solidarity, which suggests that perhaps some pro-Russian lobbyists in the European Union are pushing for the inclusion of certain conditions for a peaceful settlement from the perspective of the Russian Federation, namely rights for the Russian Orthodox Church and Russian as a second state language. You know, whichever of these two positions turns out to be true, both mean only one thing for Ukraine, that we are bending here and actually making some concrete concessions. Next, what else is in this plan? Negotiations are underway regarding the permanent administration of the occupied territories, the gradual lifting of sanctions against Russia, and Ukraine and Russia are starting to coordinate on compensation and war damages. It is proposed that the frozen assets of the Russian Federation be unfrozen after an agreement is reached between Kyiv and Moscow. At the same time, this unfreezing, well, as you know, it's not even properly frozen right now. And here they're proposing to unfreeze it even further. And actually, there are also ideas regarding peacekeepers. Perhaps this is also related to the secrecy of this meeting, because making public specific figures, data, or the number of military personnel who could enter Ukraine under certain mandates is not meant for the general public. And in order not to provoke the Russian Federation unnecessarily, all of this needs to be done quietly. Although leaks still happen, it's also very hard for me to explain why, for example, at the same time as what's happening now, we have a leak from the Financial Times, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, the summit in Budapest. So what are the real reasons why it was canceled? The Moscow memo, right? So this means that Moscow put forward very unreasonable conditions, and that's why the decision was made not to continue this conversation until Moscow is ready. What actually happened? In this piece, they called Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, a tired man so exhausted that he no longer has time to organize meetings between the two presidents. The memorandum, which was allegedly secretly handed over by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the State Department regarding a peaceful settlement, turned out to be quite tough, according to journalists from the Financial Times. Ukraine is essentially under Nazi control, that's what it says. Territorial concessions, namely Donbass, the non-occupied parts of Kherson region, Zaporizhzhia, all of that, not joining NATO, complete neutrality for Ukraine. And the key point is that Ukraine and Kyiv will never, under any circumstances, agree to this. And there are issues that have never been raised in any of the peace plans that have been presented, such as the reduction of Ukraine's armed forces. This will never happen. And obviously, at this point, the story regarding the Budapest summit comes to an end, but the Russian Federation resists. You know that the tour of the special representative of the Russian Federation, Dmitriev, is still ongoing. He spent 5 days in the United States, and now he is in Saudi Arabia. And there, in Saudi Arabia, at one of the security forums, Dmitriev once again stated that, in his opinion, the war, whether against Russia or against Ukraine, has a chance to end within the next year. And he said this is a direct quote, that Moscow and Washington are now close to a diplomatic solution. Either Dmitriev is living in his own bubble, or this really is a signal that Ukraine is in some ways making concessions. I've already told you about the Russian Orthodox Church and these repeals of language laws. In short, something is happening. And today, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Galuzin, yes, here he is, this person. Look at what he said. Moscow is ready to continue direct negotiations, and right now all the conditions exist for the development of the so-called Istanbul track. Here, it specifically emphasized the Istanbul track. According to him, the only problem remains the lack of political will on the part of Kyiv. So the level of the Istanbul negotiations, as you understand, is mainly about humanitarian issues. But Moscow obviously insists that this level is currently sufficient to demonstrate to Washington, who really does not want peace here. It is very cynical and very base on the part of the Russian Federation to do all this, especially against the backdrop of open tests of nuclear technologies like the Burevestniks and Poseidons. Where is all this leading? We have a rough idea. Well, what will happen in Madrid? We'll talk about that with you after the 4th.